This meeting is being.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Red Wheelbarrow Poetry Collective's Zoom reading session. We are very fortunate enough tonight to have Basil the Toit read for us. Basil, if you're going to introduce the poems, please do so. But I think that I assume that we'll be hearing poems from the upcoming collection. Studies in Khoisan verse, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So typically our invited poet will read for about 40 minutes and then we'll have some questions and answers, comments. We'll have a quick break and then open mic.
Okay.
Yeah. The floor is yours. We're happy to be your audience. Thank you for your time.
I'll kick off. My thanks and gratitude to all of you who are attending the reading. I'm especially thrilled that this event can bring together distant family members who are very dear to me. My daughter Helena in France, who may come in later on, my brother Colin in KwaZulu-Natal, and my cousin Greta in Cape Town. I'm also grateful to Red Wheelbarrow for all the work that you've put in for organizing the event. Now, I'm doing this reading. I like to give myself a geographical location. From my house in a small settlement on the outskirts of Edinburgh called Parthead, one of the most far-flung outposts of the Roman Empire, as it was back in the day. Many legions came to grief here. The Scots are quite proud of the fact that they halted the Romans in their tracks. So Parthead, it could be said, was the Russian front of the Roman Empire. All of the poems I've ever written, apart from a very small handful, were written in Scotland. But for this particular reading, I'm going back to my African roots, to another far-flung outpost, the British Empire, namely Botswana, once the Bechuanaland Protectorate. I am locating the focus of my reading here because this reading coincides with the imminent appearance of my third full collection of poems, a set of sonnets, which I've called Studies in Khoisan Verbs, and which is being brought out by Botsotso Publications. This new collection has been shaped and edited by Alan Polsky-Horwitz of Botsotso, and I'd like to thank him profoundly for his dedication and patience in working with me on the book. My thanks also to Botsotso generally for taking on this project in the first place. I must also gratefully acknowledge the part played by my old friend, Professor Helise van Vuren. She it was who kick-started the whole process. I hope she will be able to tune in from the safe haven of her home in Baardskeerdes Bos. But because the selection, which is going to be partly from Khoisan verbs and partly from other sonnet collections and other poems, my reading is slanted towards my experience of American poetry. So I've decided to begin this reading with a poem about the American poet Robert Lowell, who was himself a prolific composer of sonnets. My poem is called Skunk for two reasons. Firstly, one of Lowell's most famous poems is Skunk Hour, which ends with the image of a family of skunks raiding garbage bins in a small town. The second reason is that one collection of Lowell's sonnets in particular, called The Dolphin, was criticized because Lowell included extracts from letters written by his former wife, Elizabeth Hardwick, who was herself a writer. Not only was this plagiarism, it was also a personal betrayal of Hardwick in exposing her private feelings to the public. So this is my poem, Skunk. Lowell took the force of two marriages full in the face, both barrels. He landed in England in plain mid-conjugal mania, with sonnets stealing a leaf out of letters. Emulating Donne's knotted burial sheet, he had himself tied up in high altar cloth. Lithium untangled him later on. I prefer his grimmer metrics, iron in Nantucket Sound. Bedart teaches the Ur-dolphin in Wellesley. It has that kind of canonic power, ever in conversation with the Russians, sliding polished sleigh steel over frozen rivers. The poet begs everywhere, led by the nose, incurring the fury of a president, willing to dress up in dolphin, in drag, or in skunk, bum-ending himself in a rubbish dump. Now, I'm still some distance from reading poems from studies in Khoisan verbs, but I'd like to say something about that book at this stage. Khoisan verbs is a collection of 60 sonnets distilled from a much larger body of sonnets which I wrote over a period of 10 years in 2011, and which I brought out last year in 2 volumes called Gathering Photons in May, which is this here, and volume 2 is Playing with My Christianity there. Each of these contains 200 sonnets. I should just say, for those who don't know, regarding the title of the collection, the Khoisan were the first peoples of the Cape before any European settlement. Their domain extended from the Western Cape up through Namibia and into northern Botswana. Linguistically, they're famous for the extraordinary range of click sounds in their speech. All of my sonnets were written on the 3rd floor of Edinburgh University's main library, where the university's literature collections are housed. Now, one of the perils of writing in a library is the other users of the library. One might have, for example, the misfortune of sitting opposite someone with a runny nose, as I often did, someone who just sits there slurping wet mucus for hour after hour. I never had the cheek to offer such people a box of tissues. One just has to thole it, as they say in Scotland, and carry on. So I've decided to write a poem about that experience, just to contextualize it within the library. And it's called Library Session 531. I need her sniffle to force my concentration, as poets need stress metrics to force invention. Our mantra is, you can't afford to be precious. Write through the wrong pen, at a wobbly desk, write while distractions of mist veil and unveil the velvety snooker table bays of distant hills, write even though your heart is breaking, etc. Here is the time, now is the place. Your body and your brain's inadvertencies are all you have to go on. This is what the suitcase was packed for. Now go and make your journey. Far below, a saw is biting noisily into concrete. I can almost smell the hot petroleum on its breath. Oceanic green sets the hills ablaze with words. My next poem is another sonnet which doesn't appear in Khoisan verbs, but it does give a clear idea of some of the typical methods used in the Khoisan poems. In particular, it shows the mingling of one system with another. In this case, anatomical systems are mingled with geographical systems. Anyway, I like the poem, and it's called Red River Valley. Red River Valley. My blood, like a red serpent, coils itself around my organs and sips savory water from my belly. A nutrient fire fills it. My bloodstream, like a red Amazon, drains the cardiac motor and returns to it, dark and spent, having had commerce with the world in the shape of ocean-going lungs, which breathed mountains, Namibias, seas, and introduced them back into the blood as particles of adventure. Sheer brittle-sided gorges, plunging archaic forests through rainfall zones, decommissioned animals printed on primary source materials, where colonials transact their proceedings in old Cape Dutch. Now, finally, I come to a poem which is in Khoisan verbs and is called English in Africa. Now, this poem, despite its reference to English, is told from the point of view of any European language which has become Africanized through contact with other Southern African languages and realities, and whose speakers see themselves as quasi-indigenous by virtue of that Africa-evolved version of their language. English in Africa. We took the language of the Europeans and cauterized it, laughing at its prolixity. Where they would rub two sticks together to make authentic fire, we just struck a match. We beat their high vowels flat on the anvils of new phonetic forges and muses of dirt, to cure their pale linguistics into soundings more in keeping with our burnt savannas. We joined the salts of the Southern Ocean to smoky notes of Karoo herbs. We spiked our vocabularies with the gargled hullabaloo of the Cape Namakwas, our fellow Africans, who took one look at our pale complexions and called us Europeans. We gasped at the insult. And now come to the title poem of the collection, Studies in Khoisan Verbs. I referred to Botswana earlier on. I'm not any sort of expert on Khoisan languages, but they are part of my heritage and of my personal history too. When I was a boy living in Labatsi, Botswana, a Tswana man who was passing by saw me performing a magic trick involving a couple of matchsticks. He was so taken with this bit of fakery that he said he would teach me some Bushman language if I taught him the secret of the trick. I do believe that the three words he taught me were in fact authentic and from the northern branch of the Khoisan language family. But the poem itself is really about peripheral consciousness, the techniques of indirect perception which are employed in many of the sonnets themselves. Studies in Khoisan verbs. Looking is pointless because the eyes are already overburdened with duties. But there are psychological organs of perception, moral sense indicators, patches of specialized and sensitized consciousness growing on the skin. These are what can catch at wafts of the passing experience, imbibing them before standard awareness cottons on. These will give back cultural nuances the eye has not the liquids, lenses, nor muscles to deal with. Verb stems of Khoisan grammar, scrubland cobras offering us new endings for humankind. Now, my mother was born into a German Lutheran family in Southwest Africa, Namibia, another connection to the Khoisan theme. And sometimes in my poetry, I like to retell biblical stories in my own fashion. In this poem, Languages of the Snake, I go back to the earliest human story of them all, but told with an emphasis on linguistic aspects of the tale. A link to my Khoisan verbs book is my reference in this poem to the Kham language. I apologize for my poor translation, pronunciation of that word. I'll try to do better in the poem. Languages of the snake. The snake was trying out his new organs of speech, situated at the back of his throat, like a fresh pair of tonsils. He was learning to speak Farsi, snuggling that language down among the latest advances in transformational grammar. His forked tongue gave him the ability to speak two languages at the same time. He could say one thing in Arabic while stating its exact opposite in Kham. Nature had made him a serpent, but nurture was making him the subtlest Old Testament scholar of his age. Then along came the first woman on a weeding assignment, dead-heading roses and shaking pests out of sluggy bushes. She could speak only one language, an early literary dialect of Proto-Indo-European. It was beautiful, but useless for serious litigation. She lacked basic negotiating skills, apart from cheerful conjugal banter, and had not the foggiest notion of what was about to happen next. Now, I'm actually a devout atheist, and many of my poems express this fact. In my next poem, Playing with My Christianity, I refer to an orrery. An orrery is a physical model of the solar system constructed out of spheres representing the planets and L-shaped rods linking them to a central axis around which they revolve. Playing with my Christianity. Sometimes I unpack my childhood religion and play with its Roman soldiers, prostitutes, and moneylenders, its archangels, demons, and cardboard nativity scenes, its donkeys, its Herods, and its angry God, all the props that make it so charming and antiquated. Its strict little universe dances around me like a brass orrery of squealing satellites, unoiled celestial bodies circling the earth at its center. In the end, both its believers and its non-believers are allocated to their well-deserved eternities, and I pack away my little model of Christianity, so very glad that the actual world in no way resembles it. I was recently introduced to a make of fountain pen called the Lamy 2000, a classic German pen dating from the 1960s. To my mind, the Lamy 2000 is everything that a pen should not be. Very severe and no nonsense, quite Bauhaus, more a pen for civil engineers than for poets, and that's what inspired me to try a poem about it. I called it Penmanship, a homage to the Lamy 2000. This is not a pen for doggerel or doodles, but for solving quadratic equations or designing a suspension bridge. Pens can be made to write against their better natures. The pen that wrote Mein Kampf spat angrily in protest, but Hitler drove it onwards right until the bitter end. When he was finished with it, he had it drained, dry, and snapped in two. Some pens will launch crusades against the Holy Lands. Others will sink Atlantic shipping. One pen invented Mickey Mouse. How many spent quills would it take to re-feather a goose? Entire walnut escritoires full of pens fell spluttering from the hand of Marcel Proust, their nibs pigeon-toed, their ink chambers broken-winded, like relay horses galloped to exhaustion. By the imperatives of evolution, human faces, like the poems of Paul Valery, are never finished. They're only abandoned. Evolution starts to take us on a path leading towards perfection, but as soon as we get to the stage of being just good enough, it abandons us and moves on to something else. This is a sentiment I explore in the following poem called Unfinished Features. Those almost Cupid bow lips have been worked on for generations, each ancestor bequeathing one minor adjustment to their definition and then dying. Slowly, like gravity edging a riverbed into broader sweeps, or the creeping pencil lines of a sketch pad, her mouth was arrived at, only to be seen at once as a fresh point of departure. It's obviously heading for some apotheosis of ultimate beauty, but we can't wait for that. And I, for one, am more than willing to plant a kiss on those fleeting, unready, still to be perfected mouth parts. Several readers of volume 1 of my collected sonnets, which is gathering photons in May, drew favorable attention to this next poem, which really took me by surprise. I had expected a lot more stick from this poem, about this poem, and maybe I will still get it. It's called Stowaway. I was wrong. You've come back, and life has given me another chance to see your knickers drying on my radiators. It's the sheer mundanity of it that charms me, like a swallow's muddy nest in the eaves, making me hold my breath. And I've always been a bit doe-eyed when it comes to, the world of women. Cunt-struck, some have unkindly called it, which I can't really deny. I'm still fascinated by that discreet and powerful organ of yours. You are the fairer and better sex, I think. I like all the variants of your design, which is why a pod of warmth on your panties gusset will soon be carrying my kiss between your legs. Now, poetry is about pleasure and sensuality, in my view. It's great to come across this view endorsed by a 2,000-year-old Chinese poet. Yang Xiong was a Chinese philosopher and poet of the Han Dynasty, known for his Fu poetry compositions. That's Fu. Now, I'll give the definition of Fu. Fu are pieces of intermediary poetry between poetry and prose, in which a place, object, feeling, or other subject is described and rhapsodized in exhaustive detail and from as many angles as possible. And that really is the technique that I strive for in a lot of my poems. So this poem is called The Pleasures of Reading and Classical Learning in China. And a quote from Yang Xiong, 53 BC to AD 18, which is, "Books are as sexy as women. Everything that is sensual in the world, from the taste of Mexican blood oranges to the narcoleptic numbness of sleep, is concentrated in the human body. Its pickup systems are more acute than the bugging devices planted in a dissident's Moscow flat. Soft-hued galaxies fall onto the rounds of the eye, onto its ragged-rimmed iris, its black eye pupil, and open inside the brain like a flu tablet's cloudy smokings. Oils from a reader's hands linger on books, a woman's saliva on the lips of her lover. The body's welcoming secretions correctly guess the depravity of our nerves. The next poem, Campus Muse, is a poem in Khoisan verbs which Alan Horwitz and I spent many happy hours respectfully disagreeing about. It's still not quite right. Like a human face, it's been abandoned rather than finished. And I'm afraid I've tweaked it a bit for this particular reading as well. The campus is that of Rhodes University. The time is 1970, and the muse is better left unidentified. Campus Muse. She was hip and hung out in groovy threads adorned with African love beads. The age demanded that she smoke a pipe. She was a child of Aquarius. She reeked of weed and enrolled herself in mysterious sciences. Her movie star looks, framed in a silver orb of liquid nitrate, made her ripe for discovery. She went barefoot and washed just enough to leave interesting odors. Her natural body nursed bacteria fragrant as yogurt and jasmine. Her face was as soft as the orchids it had eaten. Her muscles were grown by the Eastern Cape. A pearl worn at her ear would have made it an oyster, or maybe something even moister. I apologize for the dreadful rhyme at the end there. I find the German philosopher Martin Heidegger fascinating. I love the daring and the total focus of his philosophical work. Heidegger built himself a hut near the village of Totnauberg in the Black Forest. He would retire to this hut for months at a time for prolonged, intense sessions of philosophical speculation. Recently, Heidegger's black notebooks, as they are called, were translated into English. We find him in these notebooks wrestling with his support for Hitler and the National Socialist program. The poem is called Heidegger's Hut. Long ago, the animal consumed the philosopher. He is in there somewhere, in that plump body, obedient to the simple appetites of bed, supping table, and latrine. He looks out through its eyes. He has taught it how to read and write, how to sit still for 3 hours every morning while he pursues his ideas. There is a companion who shares the bed and draws the thorn of lust out of his thinking flesh. She is, for him, the limit of the tangible. After breakfast, he turns to his great works of error. He opens a black notebook, pulls the safety pin from his brain, and starts thinking. My next poem is called The Politics of a Dutiful Daughter. The daughter in question here is Theresa May, ex-British Prime Minister, during the period of her Brexit negotiations with the European Union. As background to the poem, I should say that May's father was a Church of England clergyman. Another point of clarification is that the word Phuket at the end of the poem refers to the city of Phuket in Thailand, which was devastated by a tsunami in 2004. The politics of a dutiful daughter. She tells us the talks are starting to bear fruit. But what exactly is her definition of fruit? Are they what we might call tripe and onions? For too long, she's been feeding us her gospel of this will be good for you, victuals straight off the vicar's table, a bland Protestant diet garnished with orthodox Presbyterian greens, mealtimes of napkins and piety, headaches and secret shame. Late at night, she would pass her father's study and hear God and the vicar locked in loud, rancorous argument, both quoting from Heidegger to prove their point. One day the vicar emerged victorious. Jehovah stormed off and took his anger out on Phuket. I recently learnt, this is my second last poem. I recently learned from friends who spend a lot of time doing serious gardening that there is a new trend in gardening called no-dig gardening, which involves disturbing the soil as little as possible while you are growing things in it. And I've called the poem Shutting the Ground. In the old days, no garden was complete without an ox and a plough. Turning the soil was the least one expected from the industrious farmer. Nowadays, the avant-gardener adopts a no-dig strategy. She will not disturb the soil even a foot down, where roots and worms bind the earth together. She renounces the necessary aeration of traditional planters, keeps fungal networks intact underground, will not suffer tuberous fibers to be snapped. Like the old art of bloodletting, using ravenous river leeches, digging has become discredited. Nobody weeds anymore or eases the lockjaw of compacted soil with the probings of small forks or trowels. Such dignified tools are outmoded. Now it's all about giving a safe space to soil, not offending the natural parasites that are the heroes of horticulture in these times. The garden is returning to nature. Her agents, entropy and decay, are happy just to scratch the surface. Now, after that ultra-terrestrial poem, I'm ending with an extraterrestrial poem, part of a group that I call Taking Leave of the Earth. They say that poetry can't teach us anything or tell us anything useful, but hopefully this poem will disprove that. It's called Landing a Shithouse on the Moon. It's not as hard as you might think. With only a percentage of Earth's gravity to fight against, all it took was a few gentle puffs of jet propulsion to lower the bristly lunar vehicle onto the surface of the moon. No atmosphere equals no foul weather and no turbulence. Hence that dreamlike parabolic glide of a machine requiring no aerodynamic modeling to steady it. You could land a rickety old farmyard shithouse on the moon if you wanted to. Piloting it down would have given those gnarly cosmonauts no trouble at all, despite its ventilation holes shaped like a moon, its splintery door banging open and shut. I hope you found that useful to know. And that's the end of my reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. If we could all switch our mics on and give Basil a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The big pen is coming last week.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to end and we'll open the floor for questions. Oh, I see some hands raised already. So this part of the evening, we just try and have an informal dialogue about the poems we heard, about the process and all of that. If you have a comment, you can just raise your hand, and I'll just kind of go in that order. Ed, I see your hand is raised.
Jacques hand is raised. Well,
It's Jacques.
Yeah, Basil, I loved your reading. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
I especially like the playfulness and the humor. It's there in so many of the poems, and yeah, just your sense of wonder and curiosity. I always feel like I learn something from you every time I've heard you read. So the question that I have is just why the sonnet? Is that did you find that just a really good device, a good form, sorry, to convey ideas, sort of rhythm of the sonnet? Just curious about that.
I call them sonnets as a matter of convenience, but they're not really sonnets. They're 14 lines long, and usually, and that's about the only constraint that they share with the sonnet. But I did find that in the context in which I was writing, the destination of the 14th line was something I found extraordinarily handy to work with as I was writing. It made the whole process not very intimidating. I would get to line 9 and say, well, I've only got 5 more lines to go. I can surely do that and move on and complete those lines. But in the end, my way of thinking started to take the shape of these small forms. They're not sonnets in at least one sense, that a sonnet is dialectical. It consists of an argument, a proposal and a counter proposal and a kind of resolution. My poems have only got one voice. They don't argue in that way. They simply move from one point to the other point, mainly by accumulation. A cascade of ideas which start at a very modest point and then start to pull other things in, which I want to be as surprising as possible, and a sense of joy and wonder maybe by the time you reach line 14.
Thank you. That's extraordinary. I feel that with every single poem that you read, that I understood exactly. I everything arrived. So yeah.
Yes. I like strong arrivals.
I hear you. Jack?
Basil, thank you. That was a lovely reading. I particularly I love to think of this pairing of the No Dink poem and the poem about no poem. It's very sensitive that hardly accomplishes. It's almost too safe. You want to feel those hands reaching into the soil.
Oh
And then
yes.
Heidegger, you have this very kind of liberated consciousness in a way, but you're in danger of being blown up. When he pulls out the safety pin.
Yes.
So I'm fascinated by that juxtaposition and how do you see your own work as a poet sort of moving between those two? I mean, were you you think of the No Dink poem as quite as quite satirical, and it felt sort of gently satirical to me of a aspect of contemporary culture that I was both sort of elated and by the Heidegger poem, of course, knowing the context. I don't know if that's a question you can do anything with, or if I'm just rambling.
I've had difficulty hearing your question because you were breaking up quite a bit. I don't know if I'm the only one who's
Oh.
experiencing that.
So it's something about the juxtaposition of those two poems, the No Dink poem, which
So
is
what's the first one?
the sort of no Dink poem, the
Oh
No
yes,
Dink
yes, of
gardening
course,
poem,
shutting the ground. Yes, yes. Oh, and yes, um,
and the poem on Heidegger. And it's
yes. I mean,
these are maybe two kinds of things that poetry also can do.
yes. I mean, I'm astonished that you link the two poems together. But what they certainly for me do share is um, a sense of withholding from the processes that I'm describing. I do find it rather fascinating that some people um, are having a very sort of almost well, an ecological concern with not violating the integrity of soil. At the same time, I
Yes.
was brought up in the idea of digging the soil to let the air in. So I have difficulty taking that on board. Similarly with
Mm.
Heidegger, I'm fascinated by his power of philosophical reasoning, and disturbed by his endorsement of Nazism for long periods. Actually, I suppose I'm not even so worried about that as the fact that he threw um, one of my favorite philosophers out of his post, Edmund Husserl. Because Edmund Husserl was Jewish, and therefore I think Heidegger, who was a student of Husserl, um, got him removed and took his place at the University of Jena, I think it was. I found that extraordinary betrayal. So
Yeah.
it's a mixture of being fascinated but not being able to quite endorse either of those two processes.
Yes. Yes, I get that. Yeah. Oh, they're both gorgeous poems.
Oh, thank you. I should perhaps make a sort of confession here. I was brought up in, I suppose, a very chauvinistic environment called South Africa, where poetry is not really regarded as a particularly masculine activity. There's associations of effeminacy and that sort of thing. And that sort of rubbed off on me, definitely. So I cannot give myself entirely to poetry either. I feel I have to make a bit of a joke of it, or be ironical about it a little bit, or make a few moves of distancing myself from the whole process. I don't want to endorse the whole thing in case I'm regarded as gay or effeminate or whatever. These are obviously deep psychological misgivings about poetry, and that partly explains the way I write poetry. It's to keep it at a distance.
That's fascinating.
I'm a South African after all. I was brought up in that kind of culture. Can't get away from it.
Yeah. I'm still running.
Fascinating. Um, I was, I mean, in many ways, and then you spoke about the not being, the poems not being sonnets, but in many ways, these a, serious convention.
Yes.
The poems are full of so much humor and rhythm. I wondered if in your writing process, you establish that rhythm first, like the words or the language, directed?
It's hard to say. I think what I have is a voice that I want to hear the poem speaking, and I try to remain faithful to that voice, which is allied to rhythm. I never use. I mean, at one point I wrote a longish poem in iambic pentameters, and I decided, well, I can do iambic pentameters. I'm not going to do them again. I've had my fill of iambic pentameters. But rhythm is very, very important to me, and the sense of the way that the poem moves from your mouth, and its pauses and accelerations, for me, don't seem accidental, or at the same time not being based on any formal structure. So it's somewhere between formal metrics and a sense of voice music that I hear as I'm developing the theme. And I'm very, very wedded to the idea of good rhythm in a poem.
Mm, 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 mm. Interesting, thank you. Anybody else have a question or a comment?
It was a great reading, Basil. Enjoyed it as ever.
Thanks, Christine.
Yeah. Just put a word in for Mrs. May. I may,
Yes.
given that my middle name is May.
Right.
Just a bit of a fun, really. You talk about the tripe and onions. I mean, I think, yes, she failed in many ways. I think perhaps trying to be even-handed and to listen to a wide range of opinion in a wide-ranging cabinet, unlike her successor, Boris Johnson, who flung out everybody he disagreed with before he started.
Yes.
And do you think his oven-baked meal was any better than her tripe and onions? And has not every prime minister since had to battle with the same issue over Northern Ireland? And we're slowly getting there. But I think you're rather cruel on her. And perhaps on God too, when you mentioned the Old Testament God. I think in the same way you engage with science, I think you could use your mind to engage with religion as well, and try and get a more nuanced view of the whole thing.
Yes. Well, certainly Theresa May, I hated her at the time, but subsequently I feel a lot of sympathy for her, and I like the sorts of things she's been saying as a backbencher in Parliament.
Yeah.
Since then, Boris Johnson got Brexit through by driving a caterpillar through some fake bricks and by basically lying.
Yeah.
Whereas she is a totally conscientious politician, who would never stoop to those kind of tactics.
Because
But
of her moral integrity, which comes from, her background.
Yes. So
So
I have great sympathy for Theresa May, but none whatsoever for her Jehovah.
well, fair enough, yes. But I think, yes, I think it's worth more consideration. I'm not trying to back up Mrs.
No,
May
of
at
course
all,
not.
but considering the people who came after her,
Oh, yes,
Liz Truss and
definitely,
Boris
yes.
Johnson. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. I think a little bit of her tripe and onions maybe wasn't quite so bad.
That's quite right. It may be quite a healthy diet after all.
Yes. Anyway,
But the thing is, I don't know, a lot of people disagree with me, but the whole enterprise of Brexit was misconceived, was never going to work anyway, as far as I was concerned. So it doesn't matter what Theresa May tried, she was going to fail.
No, she tried too hard to
Couldn't
please
keep the union together as well as come out of the European Union, and that was the basic circle you were trying to square.
Yeah. She hadn't been a believer in it anyway.
No, that's right. It's very perplexing.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for trying to reconcile me to two of my principal opponents in life.
Douglas. You're muted, Douglas.
Basil, it seems to me that the engine of your poems is at a linguistic level. The jamming together of contexts that are not naturally cousins, and using phrases from specialist languages, specialist corners of language, and
Yes.
dragging them into other contexts so that they surprise, jar, work against, work for. That's perhaps you could talk a little about that, the kind of language of your poetry and how that supplies the energy of the poems.
Oh, that's a difficult topic. But linguistics is at the core of my poetry, definitely. I like to see various kinds of structural analogies between things. The human body, artificial machines, and language. And for me, language is the core comparative structure. So I like to see things which have a linguistic structure, clauses, different functions of machines and elements. So physical machines I love as well, because to me they are kind of linguistic structure. And for me, in almost a literal sense, language makes the world. Therefore, it has a part to play. It is part of the material of the world itself. So once you're approaching it through language, you're already inside the object, because language takes you deep inside the object, and you can't really get into it without making more words. You can't just look at it and hope to go forward. You've got to make vocabulary as you go forward in your discoveries. And therefore, a consciousness of language and a perception of what the world's made of sort of go hand in hand. So that's all I can say really, but you're quite correct that language is at the core of many of these poems. I used to be terrified of grammar. It was my worst subject at school. I got some shocking results at school. C was the highest mark I got. F was mathematics, and I think E was like grammar sort of thing, very, very low. If it weren't for the fact that South African universities that at that time took you in, if you were white, I suppose, no matter what your qualification from school was, just to give you one chance, one shot at a university career. So you had to prove yourself in the first year at university. If it hadn't been for that policy, I would never have got in to Rhodes University. And it took me many, many years, decades, to overcome my fear of nouns, verbs, adverbs, subordinate clauses, and such things, and talk about them with fun, with joy and happiness.
It seems to me that more than one writer, really since the 20th century, has been trying to break the straitjacket, in a way, of language.
Yes.
Either attempting pure, a road to pure perception, or fragmenting the tools of writing, i.e. language, breaking grammar, breaking spelling, breaking punctuation, trying to smash language, and yet persist in being able to express themselves adequately.
Yes.
And I wonder about those sorts of ventures, because finally we arrive back at the fact that within the conscious mind, we're inside I use the word machine advisedly, but we're inside a grammar.
Yes.
And one's whole culture is determined by that grammar. If you speak more than one, if you're fluent in more than one language and you have access to more than one culture and grammar through different languages, one is particularly blessed. But I wonder about all of those enterprises to break away from that, and whether they can be any way be said to be successful because of that presence that the self is built
Yes.
within the house of language and the house of that language's grammar.
Well, I've always been riding both horses at the same time. I mean, there is this split between, let's say, formalists in poetry and the avant-garde, particularly seen in American poetry, where, let's say, Wallace Stevens would be on the formalist side, and Ezra Pound would be on the other side, the avant-gardist. And because of my philosophical background, I love absolute clarity and simplicity in expression. And I can't get away with it. I can't really express myself unless I'm trying to be absolutely clear and absolutely unambiguous, and to use language as precisely as possible. But precisely for that reason, I'm deeply attracted to the whole school of poetry that stems from Ezra Pound, Zhukovsky, Carl Rakoczy, Gary Snyder, that entire tradition of the new American poetry, John Ashbery, and in England, of course, J.H. Prynne, and a lot of poets like that. I read those poets with immense amount of pleasure and joy, and I've always tried, in a sense, to emulate them without quite leaving the safety, as you say, of the syntactic structure. I've tried to shake up my poetry a lot in those sorts of ways, but I've never been able to break out of the straitjacket of proper grammar, really. But nevertheless, I'm absolutely fascinated by the attempts to do so, and in awe of how they managed to do that. I love them. I read them more than I do other kinds of poets who are more formal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas, for your question. Ian Ball has a question. I think you answered most of it. Ian wants to know, who do you read and admire? Just want to maybe just elaborate on that, or Ian, if you feel as though that question was answered, we can move on. And I see Tsitsi has raised a hand.
Yes, thank you. Basil, I really find your poetry intriguing.
Thank you.
Very layered, actually. And I was wondering if you did that intentionally, to mix it all up, the different layers, and like there's a bit of cheek, there's a bit of intrigue here, there's a bit of it's very interesting how you lay it all. Is it intentional, or do you just find yourself in a situation?
Yes, I agree with you that that's the effect that the poems may have, but whether I intend them or not quite clearly as I'm writing them, or that they just happen, I don't actually set out to do that kind of layering, but as I'm writing, I can't help getting into that kind of texturing. I just love incongruity, and I like to puncture seriousness and pretension and so on. I can't be serious for too long. Even my most tragic sounding poems always have the tongue in the cheek. I can't really write poetry without that sort of ironical attitude, which means that I can't really write serious political poetry. because I always have to be undercutting myself and thinking of some alternative to what I'm saying. And I just love all that layering, the jokes coming in, mixing the registers of language, formal language and slang, as much as I can permit myself to use slang, and certainly using strong language, obscene language, swear words and so on, which I like to throw in every now and again as a kind of hand grenade into the poem. In myself, I never use those words in my ordinary way of speaking. I never use bad language when I speak, but I love chucking some of these poems words into poems and giving the reader a bit of a jolt. It's a playful attitude. All in all, that is my fundamental feeling about poetry. It's being playful and a matter of joy and pleasure and sensuality. So thanks for your question.
Yes, thank you. Any final questions or comments, or shall we leave it at that?
Well, thank you very much indeed for letting me read and for all your interest in your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, for your time, for your craft, Basil. May you continue to write for joy. I'm going to,
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording. I saw quite a few people arrived late and some had to leave, but the recording will be available very soon.
Yes.